The rain hammered against my apartment window at 11:47 p.m. when 3 soft knocks broke through the storm. I wasn't expecting anyone. Hell, I barely knew my neighbors in this concrete maze they called downtown Portland. But something about those knocks felt different, deliberate, almost apologetic. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I cracked the door open, chain still attached, and found myself staring at a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a different decade. Elegant coat, perfectly styled hair despite the downpour, and eyes that held secrets I couldn't begin to guess. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you Marcus Chen?" The way she said my name made my stomach drop. Nobody had called me by my full name in months, not since I'd been hiding out in this studio apartment, licking my wounds from the bankruptcy that destroyed everything I'd built. "Depends who's asking," I replied, studying her face. But she had to. Be in her 40s, maybe pushing 50, but there was something timeless about her presence. I said, "You're 50?" And she whispered back, "That's why I knocked us. Give me 10 minutes of your time." That's when I knew my quiet life of isolation was about to shatter completely. The woman standing in my doorway didn't look like trouble. But then again, trouble rarely announces itself with a business card. She stood there in the flickering hallway light, water dripping from her umbrella onto the stained carpet, waiting for me to make a decision that would change everything. 10 minutes, I repeated, glancing at the digital clock on my microwave. It was almost midnight on a Tuesday, and I had nowhere to be except my couch, drowning in another episode of some mindless series. "Lady, I don't even know you." "My name is Victoria Whitmore," she said, reaching into her purse with slow, deliberate movements. "And you knew my daughter?" The name hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Whitmore. I hadn't heard that name in 6 years. "Not since Sarah," I whispered, my grip loosening on the door handle. Victoria nodded, her composure cracking just slightly. Around the edges, Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore. She died in the car accident on Highway 26, December 15th, 2018. The chain felt heavy in my hands as I undid it, stepping back to let her in. My studio apartment suddenly felt smaller than a coffin, cluttered with the remnants of a life I'd been trying to rebuild. Empty takeout containers, stacks of unpaid bills, and the laptop where I spent my days applying for jobs that never called back. Victoria entered like she was walking into a church, her eyes taking in every detail without judgment. "Ugh," she set her umbrella by the door and removed her coat, revealing a navy dress that probably cost more than my rent. "I know this is unexpected," she began, settling into the only decent chair I owned, a leather recliner I'd salvaged from my old office before. "The creditors took everything else. But I've been looking for you for quite some time, Marcus." I remained standing, arms crossed, trying to process why Sarah's mother was in my apartment at midnight. Sarah and I had dated for 8 months back in 2018. Nothing serious by most standards, but she'd meant something to me. When she died in that accident, I'd attended the funeral, paid my respects, and tried to move on like everyone else. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry for your loss. I really am, but that was 6 years ago. What could you possibly need from me now?" Victoria reached into her purse again, this time pulling out a manila envelope that looked worn from handling. Before Sarah died, she was working on something. A project that consumed her final months. She never told me much about it, just that it involved people she'd met, stories she'd collected. She handed me the envelope, and I could feel the weight of whatever was inside. "After the accident, I found this in her apartment, along with your name and address, though you've moved several times since then." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what looked like a partially completed manuscript. The first page bore a title that made my blood run cold. "The Forgotten Ones. Stories of Second Chances." "I don't understand," I said, flipping through pages covered in Sarah's familiar handwriting. There were interviews with homeless veterans, single mothers, ex-convicts, trying to rebuild their lives, and my photograph stared back at me from page 47. It was taken outside the small marketing firm I used to own, back when I thought I had the world figured out. Below it, Sarah had written, Marcus Chen, 32, entrepreneur. Built a company from nothing, lost it all to a business partner's betrayal. Currently searching for meaning beyond material success. She interviewed you, Victoria said quietly. 3 weeks before she died, you were going to be her final chapter. The room started spinning. I remembered that conversation now. Sarah had called it a coffee date. Asked me casual questions about my business, my dreams, my failures. I'd thought she was just being supportive, maybe even romantically interested again. I never realized she was documenting my story. But we never finished, I said, looking up at Victoria. She died before she could help you, Victoria finished. Before she could share what she'd discovered about people like you. People who've lost everything but still have something valuable to offer the world. I sank onto my couch, the manuscript heavy in my lap. Page after page revealed Sarah's incredible, a gift for seeing hope in hopelessness, for finding the human story behind every failure and setback. Each interview subject had been carefully chosen, their struggles documented with compassion and insight. There's a man named Robert Martinez, Victoria continued, pointing to another section. Lost his construction business when the housing market crashed. Sarah found him living in his truck. But she also discovered he'd been secretly building homes for flood victims with donated materials. She flipped to another page. Jennifer Walsh, former bank executive who lost everything in a fraud scandal she had nothing to do with. Sarah caught her volunteering at 3 different shelters while studying for her GED because her degree had become worthless. Story after story, each more remarkable than the last. People who'd been knocked down by life but refused to stay down. People who'd found ways to contribute, to matter, despite having nothing left to lose. Why are you showing me this? I asked, though part of me already knew. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she'd probably been holding back for years. Because Sarah believed your story wasn't finished. She thought you were the key to something bigger, something that could help all these people she'd found. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm nobody special. I lost my company, my house, my savings. I'm barely keeping this apartment and living on ramen noodles. I can't help anyone. That's exactly why you can, she said firmly. Sarah wrote something in her notes about you. She said you understood failure in a way that successful people never could. You'd been broken down to your essential parts and were slowly rebuilding yourself with authenticity instead of ego. She reached for another section of the manuscript, one I hadn't noticed before. It was titled The Network Theory and contained Sarah's hypothesis about connecting people who'd lost everything but gained wisdom. She believed that people like you, people who'd been through real loss, could create something unprecedented. Not a business or charity in the traditional sense, but a network of authentic support, people helping people based on shared understanding rather than pity or profit. I read Sarah's notes, her excitement practically leaping off the page. Identified patterns among her interview subjects, common threads that went beyond their individual struggles. They were all resourceful in ways they'd never been when they had money. They were all more empathetic, more creative, more willing to take risks, because they'd already lost everything. She thought I could organize something like this. She thought you could lead it, Victoria corrected. There's a difference. Outside, the storm was intensifying, rain lashing against the windows, like nature itself was demanding my attention. I looked around my sparse apartment, at the life I'd been living in the shadows, and tried to imagine myself as the person Sarah had seen. What exactly are you asking me to do? Victoria leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, asking you to finish what she started. To find these people, the ones in her manuscript and others like them, to build the network she envisioned. With what money? What resources? Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate what Sarah was trying to do, but I can barely take care of myself. That's where you're wrong, Victoria said, pulling out a final document from her purse. It was a bank statement with my name on it, showing a balance that made me dizzy. Sarah left instructions in her will. Something happened to her before the project was complete. And if I could find you and convince you to continue her work, then her entire inheritance was to be transferred to your name. Enough to change everything. The papers shook in my hands. $250,000. Enough to rebuild my life, pay off my debts, start over completely. Or enough to honor Sarah's vision and help dozens of other people start over too. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There's one condition, Victoria added. The money can't be used for personal gain. It has to go toward building the network she described. If you accept it, you're committing to spending the next year of your life finding and connecting the people in her manuscript. I stared at the bank statement, then at the manuscript, then at Victoria's hopeful face. 6 years ago, I'd thought. I understood success and failure, profit and loss. My eye was being offered a chance to discover what Sarah had seen in me, something I'd never recognized in myself. The clock on my microwave read 12:23 a.m. in 23 minutes. Had been shattered and rebuilt. The woman sitting across from me wasn't just Sarah's mother. She was offering me a chance to honor someone who'd believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. What happens if I say no? Victoria smiled sadly, and the money goes to charity, and Sarah's project dies with her. These people remain isolated, struggling alone, never knowing they're part of something larger. And if I say yes, then you become the person she always knew you could be. The rain continued to fall, but something inside me was shifting, like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. For the first time in years, I felt the stirring of something I'd almost forgotten. Purpose. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Victoria had left around 1 a.m., taking her umbrella and her life-changing offer with her, but leaving behind Sarah's manuscript and a business card with her phone number. Take your time, she'd said, but not too much time. Some of these people can't wait much longer. By dawn, I'd read every page of Sarah's research twice. The stories were incredible, but what struck me most was her methodology. She hadn't just collected sob stories or inspirational comebacks. She'd identified specific skills, resources, and connections that each person possessed despite their circumstances. Robert Martinez wasn't just a homeless former contractor. He had relationships with supply companies who donated materials. Jennifer Walsh wasn't just an unemployed banker. She understood financial systems in ways that could help others navigate bankruptcy and debt. Sarah had seen what I'd missed. These weren't just broken people. They were people with unique expertise. Born from surviving the UN Zuva, the first person I decided to find was David Kim, a former software engineer who'd lost everything when his startup failed, and his co-founder disappeared with their funding. According to Sarah's notes, he was living in a converted garage in southeast Portland, doing freelance coding jobs for cash while fighting a severe depression that had cost him his marriage. I found the address Wednesday morning. A narrow house, squeezed between 2 apartment buildings in the Alberta district. The garage was accessible through a side yard littered with broken bicycles and rain-soaked cardboard boxes. When I knocked, the door opened to reveal a man who looked like he hadn't seen sunlight in months. David Kim, I asked. He squinted at me suspiciously. Depends who's asking. If you're here about rent, I already talked to Mrs. Patterson. My name is Marcus Chen. I think we have some things in common. Something in my tone must have registered because he opened the door wider, revealing a space that was part bedroom, part office, and entirely depressing. Multiple computer monitors glowed in the darkness, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and takeout containers. Sarah Whitmore interviewed you about 2 years ago, I said, pulling out her manuscript. She was working on a project about people rebuilding after major setbacks. David's expression changed immediately. Sarah, God, I heard about the accident. She was ... She was really trying to help people, you know. Most journalists just want a tragic story, but she actually listened. I spent the next hour explaining what Victoria had told me, watching David's eyes grow wider as I described Sarah's vision for connecting people like us. When I mentioned the funding, he actually laughed, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him. You're telling me that someone wants to pay us to help each other? It sounds too good to be true, maybe, I admitted. But what if it's not? What? If Sarah was onto something real? David walked to his computer setup, pulling up several programs I didn't recognize. You know what I've been doing for the past 6 months? Building apps for rich kids who want to rate their friends or find the nearest artisanal coffee shop. Mindless garbage that pays my rent but makes me want to disappear. Turned back to me, and for the first time I saw a spark of the person he used to be. But if there was a way to use my skills for something that actually mattered, would that look like? David was quiet for a long moment, then started typing rapidly. Sarah talked to me about this idea. What if people like us could share resources in real time? It's not just money, but skills, connections, opportunities. Like, I know Jennifer Walsh from the Manuscript. I helped her set up a basic website for her volunteer work. What if there was a platform where she could instantly connect with other people who needed financial advice, and I could connect with people who needed coding work? As he spoke, his fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up wireframes and mock-ups he'd apparently been working on in his spare time. I've been building this for months, ever since Sarah planted the idea. I called it the Ripple Network, but I never had the resources to actually launch it or find the people to populate it. I stared at the screen, watching David navigate through a sophisticated platform that could revolutionize how people in crisis situations supported each other. This wasn't just a social network or job board, it was something entirely new. How long would it take to make this functional? With proper funding and a dedicated team? Maybe 3 months? Marcus, it's not just about the technology. Sarah understood that. The real work is finding the right people and convincing them to trust each other. That afternoon, we drove across town to find Jennifer Walsh. Sarah's notes indicated she was working at a food bank in North Portland, while attending community college classes in the evening. We found her organizing donated vegetables with an efficiency that spoke to her banking background. Jennifer, I called out as she directed volunteers with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing complex operations. She turned. I immediately understood why Sarah had been drawn to her story. Despite working in a warehouse surrounded by donated goods, Jennifer carried herself with professional dignity. Her clothes were simple but impeccably maintained, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "Are you reporters?" she asked, eyeing us with the wariness of someone who'd been burned by media attention before. "Not exactly," I replied, introducing myself and David. "We're here about Sarah Whitmore's project." Jennifer's expression softened immediately. Sarah. That girl had such vision. She saw things in people that they couldn't see in themselves.
Ice.
She gestured for us to follow her to a quieter corner of the warehouse. She told me about her theory about connecting people who'd been through real hardship. I thought it was beautiful, but impossible. What if it wasn't impossible? David asked, pulling out his laptop to show her the Ripple Network interface. For the next 20 minutes, Jennifer peppered us with questions that revealed the sharp, analytical mind that had once managed millions of dollars in investments. She understood immediately how the platform could work. But more importantly, she grasped the human dynamics that would make or break such an endeavor. "The challenge isn't technology," she said finally. "It's trust. People who've lost everything become very protective of what little they have left. You're asking them to be vulnerable again, to risk disappointment. But what if the alternative is staying isolated?" I asked. Sarah documented dozens of people who are struggling alone when they could be helping each other. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out her phone and showed us a series of text messages. "These are from people I've met here at the food bank. Former professionals, small business owners, people with real skills who are just trying to survive day to day." She scrolled through the messages: a former restaurant owner asking for advice on bankruptcy proceedings, an ex-teacher wondering if anyone knew about remote tutoring opportunities, a laid-off nurse looking for part-time healthcare work. They're already trying to connect, Jennifer realized. They just don't have an effective way to do it. By the end of the week, our impromptu team had grown to 6 people. Robert Martinez, the former contractor, brought a practical perspective and connections throughout the city's Latino community. Maria Santos, a former event planner who'd lost her business during the pandemic, understood logistics and organization. Tom Bradley, an ex-police officer turned security guard after a controversial incident ended his career, knew how to navigate bureaucracy and connect with city services. Each person brought not just their professional skills, but hard-won wisdom about surviving loss and rebuilding from nothing. More importantly, they brought networks of other people in similar situations the invisible community of the formerly successful who were now struggling in silence. We met regularly at Jennifer's apartment, the only space large enough to accommodate our growing group. The conversations were unlike anything I'd experienced in my previous business ventures. There was no posturing, no hidden agendas, no competition for status. Everyone had already lost their status. What remained was pure collaboration born from shared understanding. The beauty of Sarah's vision, Maria explained during one of our planning sessions, is that she understood something most people miss. When you lose everything external money, position, reputation, you discover what's actually essential. We're not the same people we were before our setbacks. We're better versions, stripped of ego and pretense. David had been working 8 an hour, days refining the Ripple Network platform, incorporating feedback from each team member. The result was something unprecedented, a system that matched people not just based on skills and needs, but on shared experiences and mutual understanding. "Look at this," he said, demonstrating the platform's core feature. "Robert needs electrical work done on a housing project for homeless veterans. Tom has a connection with a retired electrician who's looking for meaningful volunteer work. Maria knows about a foundation that funds exactly these kinds of projects. Instead of 3 separate dead ends, we have a complete solution." Jennifer had been working on the financial architecture. It's creating sustainable models that could support the network without relying entirely on Sarah's inheritance. Can't just spend down $250,000 and hope for the best. She argued, we need revenue streams that align with our mission. Her solution was elegant. The platform would be free for individuals, but organizations, nonprofits, small businesses, community groups could pay modest fees for premium features. That helped them connect with our network of skilled, motivated people. "It's not charity," she explained. "It's recognizing that people who've been through real hardship often develop skills and perspectives that are incredibly valuable to the right organizations." Tom had been reaching out to people in Sarah's manuscript who lived outside Portland, building a database of potential network members across the country. His law enforcement background had taught him how to find people who didn't want to be found. His own experience with professional disgrace gave him credibility with people who'd been publicly humiliated. "The response has been incredible," he reported. "People are hungry for this kind of connection. They're tired of hiding, tired of pretending they're okay when they're barely hanging on." As our first month of intensive planning drew to a close, I realized something profound had happened. I was no longer the broken businessman Victoria had found in that studio apartment. Working with this team, building something meaningful from Sarah's vision, had restored parts of myself I thought were permanently lost. But more than personal restoration, I'd discovered something Sarah had intuited from the beginning. People who've survived complete failure possess a kind of wisdom and resilience that successful people rarely develop. We'd learned to find solutions with limited resources, to collaborate without ego, to take risks because we'd already lost everything that mattered to our former selves. The night before we planned to launch the Ripple Network beta version, I called Victoria to update her on our progress. Her voice through the phone carried a mixture of pride and sadness. "Sarah would be amazed," she said. "You've built exactly what she envisioned, but faster and more comprehensively than she ever imagined possible. We had advantages she didn't anticipate," I replied. "We found each other at the perfect moment when we were ready to risk everything again, but this time for something bigger than ourselves." And the people in her manuscript, 43 of them have joined the network. We facilitated over 200 connections, launched 16 collaborative projects, and helped dozens of people find meaningful work. But Victoria, that's just the beginning. I looked around Jennifer's apartment, where David was putting finishing touches on the platform while Robert and Maria planned our first major community event. Tom was on the phone with someone in Chicago who wanted to start a Ripple Network chapter there. Sarah didn't just document individual stories of resilience, I continued. She identified the foundation for a completely new model of mutual support. We're not just helping people recover from setbacks. We're proving that those setbacks can become the basis for something unprecedented. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. "You've honored her memory in ways I never could have imagined." Marcus, what happens next? How do you sustain something this ambitious? It was a question we'd been grappling with constantly. The inheritance money could fund our operations for maybe 2 years if we were careful. But building a national network of people committed to authentic mutual support required resources and infrastructure far beyond what any individual could provide. That's the beautiful part, I said, watching my teammates work with the focused intensity of people who'd found their calling. Sarah's real genius wasn't just identifying resilient individuals. She understood that people who've been broken down and rebuilt themselves don't need traditional incentives to collaborate, or motivated by something deeper than profit or recognition. The storm that had brought Victoria to my door 6 weeks earlier felt like a lifetime ago. Tomorrow, we would launch the Ripple Network publicly, inviting people across the country to join something unprecedented. We had no guarantee it would work on a large scale, no promise that we could sustain the momentum we'd built. But for the first time since my business collapsed years earlier, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was meant to do. Sarah had seen something in me that I couldn't see in myself, not just the potential to recover from failure, but the possibility of transforming that failure into the foundation for something entirely new. The launch of the Ripple Network didn't happen with fanfare or press releases. Instead, it began at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday when Elena Rodriguez, a former restaurant owner from Sacramento, posted the first real request on our platform. Need advice on converting commercial kitchen space to community meal prep? Have equipment? Lack permits knowledge. Within an hour, 3 people had responded. Tom connected her with a retired health inspector from Portland. Robert knew about a similar project in Phoenix that had navigated the bureaucratic maze successfully. Maria had contacts at a foundation that specifically funded community kitchen initiatives by noon. Elena was on a 3-way video call with people she'd never met, planning a community kitchen that would serve her neighborhood while providing job training for other people, trying to rebuild their lives. It was exactly what Sarah had envisioned, authentic connection leading to tangible solutions. This is how it spreads, David explained to me as we watched the platform's activity feed. Not through marketing or promotion, but through results. People see real problems getting solved and they want to be part of it. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Rachel Murphy from the Portland Police Bureau had heard about our work through Tom's contacts in law enforcement. She arrived at our weekly meeting with a proposition that would test everything we'd built. I've got a problem that traditional social services can't solve, she said, settling into Jennifer's living room with the weary posture of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. We're dealing with a wave of professionals who've become homeless due to medical bankruptcies. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, people with advanced degrees living in tents because one medical crisis destroyed decades of financial stability. She pulled out a tablet and showed us photographs that were difficult to process. A former cardiac surgeon washing dishes at a shelter. A patent attorney sleeping in her car outside the law library where she once worked. An aerospace engineer panhandling with a sign that read, "Lost everything to cancer treatment. Anything helps." These people don't fit into existing support systems, Rachel continued. They're overqualified for entry-level jobs, but they're professional. Reputations are damaged by homelessness. They need specialized help that understands their unique circumstances. Jennifer leaned forward, her banker's mind already processing the complexities. What are you asking us to do? I want to pilot a program using your network. Can you connect these people with others who've navigated similar challenges? Create pathways back to meaningful work that don't require them to hide their current circumstances. It was our first real test beyond individual success stories. Could the Ripple Network handle a coordinated response to a complex social problem? Did our model work when lives literally hung in the balance? Within a week, we'd identified 12 professionals in Rachel's files who matched people already in our network. Dr. Amanda Foster, the homeless cardiac surgeon, was connected with Dr. James Wright, a former emergency room physician who'd lost his practice due to addiction issues but had successfully rebuilt his career through telemedicine consulting. The conventional wisdom says, I need to get housed first, then cleaned up, then slowly work my way back into medicine, Amanda explained during our first video conference. But James is showing me that there are immediate ways to use my skills. While I'm addressing the housing situation, James had developed a model of providing remote medical consultations for underserved communities. Work that paid well enough to afford housing, but didn't require the traditional credentialing that Amanda's homelessness had complicated. More importantly, it restored her sense of professional identity while she rebuilt her stability. The breakthrough isn't just practical, Dr. Wright explained to our team, it's psychological. Amanda isn't being asked to pretend her setback didn't happen or to start over from scratch. She's using the wisdom she gained from losing everything to help other people in crisis. Similar connections were forming across the network. Patricia Blackwood, the homeless patent attorney, was working with Marcus Thompson, former corporate lawyer who'd lost his firm to embezzlement charges he'd been cleared of years later. Patricia's legal expertise was helping community organizations navigate intellectual property issues while she rebuilt her professional foundation, but the most remarkable transformation involved Dr. Stephen Chang, the aerospace engineer. His connection with Rosa Martinez, a former NASA contractor who'd lost her security clearance due to financial problems, led to something neither of them had anticipated. We were both trying to get back into the aerospace industry, Stephen explained during one of our monthly network gatherings. But Rosa suggested we think differently. What if our experience was system failure, personal and professional made us uniquely qualified to solve certain engineering problems? They'd begun consulting on failure analysis projects. Using their technical expertise combined with their personal understanding of how systems collapse under stress, major manufacturers were hiring them to identify potential failure points in complex systems work that required both technical knowledge and hard-won wisdom about how things fall apart. Companies have engineers who understand how systems are supposed to work, Rosa added. But they rarely have people who deeply understand how and why systems fail catastrophically. Our setbacks became our competitive advantage. News of our success with Rachel's pilot program spread through channels we hadn't anticipated. Social workers, probation officers, and community organizers began reaching out with their own impossible cases, people whose circumstances didn't fit traditional support models. 3 months after launch, we received a call that would change everything. Dr. Patricia Williams, Director of Social Innovation at the Gates Foundation, had been following our work through contacts in the nonprofit sector. What you've built challenges fundamental assumptions about resilience and recovery, she said during our first phone conversation. Most programs try to help people return to their previous circumstances. You're helping them evolve into something new and often more effective than they were before their setbacks. She wanted to fund a comprehensive study of our model, with the possibility of scaling it nationally. The grant proposal she outlined would provide funding for 50 network coordinators across the country, each building local chapters of the Ripple network in their communities. But there's a condition, Dr. Williams continued. We need to understand why your approach works when similar programs have failed. What makes the difference between people who use setbacks as foundations for growth versus those who remain stuck in cycles of recovery and relapse? The question launched us into the deepest research we'd undertaken. Working with academic partners, we began analyzing the characteristics that distinguish successful network members from those who struggled to engage meaningfully. Jennifer led the data analysis, applying her financial background to identify patterns in human behavior and outcomes. What she discovered contradicted most conventional wisdom about resilience and recovery. It's not about the severity of the setback, she reported during a presentation to the Gates Foundation team. We have network members who lost everything, businesses, homes, families, health, who are thriving. And we have people with relatively minor setbacks who struggle to move forward. The key variable wasn't the magnitude of loss, but the individual's relationship to failure itself. People who succeeded in the network had learned to view their setbacks as information rather than judgment. They saw failure as data about what didn't work, not evidence of their inadequacy as human beings. There's something else, David added, pulling up network analytics on his laptop. The most successful members aren't trying to return to their previous lives. They're using their experience of loss to build something entirely different. Dr. Chang and Rosa Martinez were perfect examples. Instead of fighting to regain their former positions in aerospace, They'd created a new niche that leveraged their unique combination of technical expertise and failure experience. They weren't recovering from their setbacks, they were capitalizing on them. This insight led to a fundamental shift in how we structured network connections. Instead of matching people with similar losses, we began connecting people whose failures complemented each other in potentially productive ways. Michael Torres, a former restaurant chain owner who'd lost everything to a business partner's fraud, was connected with Sarah Kim, a former marketing executive who'd been professionally destroyed by a social media controversy. Separately, they were struggling to rebuild their reputations. Together, they created a consulting firm that helped small businesses navigate crisis communications and partnership disputes. "We're not trying to forget what happened to us," Michael explained. "We're using those experiences as the foundation for helping other people avoid similar disasters. Our failures became our credentials." The approach was yielding remarkable results, but it also revealed uncomfortable truths about conventional approaches to helping people in crisis. Most social services were designed to return people to a previous state of functioning. Our model was proving that sometimes the previous state was the problem. Amanda Foster, former cardiac surgeon, made this point during a presentation to medical professionals about alternative career paths after setbacks. "I spent 20 years as a surgeon focused on individual patients in crisis situations. The experience of losing everything taught me to think about systemic health issues and prevention. I'm having more impact on public health now than I ever did in the operating room." 6 months after launch, the Ripple Network had grown to over 800 active members across 15 states. We facilitated thousands of connections, launched dozens of collaborative projects, and helped hundreds of people find meaningful work that utilized their unique combination of professional skills and hard-won wisdom. But the most profound change wasn't in our members' external circumstances, it was in how they understood their own stories. People stopped seeing their setbacks as interruptions to their real lives and began recognizing them as the foundation for more authentic, purposeful work. Victoria Whitmore visited us on the network's 6-month anniversary, touring the Portland hub we'd established in a converted warehouse space. The facility housed David's expanded technology team, Jennifer's Resource Coordination Center, and meeting spaces for the dozens of working groups that had formed organically among network members. "Sarah would be overwhelmed," Victoria said, watching a dozen conversations happening simultaneously, a former banker explaining cryptocurrency to a group of small business owners, ex-teachers developing online education platforms, former tech executives planning a worker-owned cooperative. "This isn't what she envisioned," I admitted. "It's bigger and more complex than anything in her original notes." Victoria smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her. That's exactly what she would have wanted. Sarah always said the best ideas were the ones that outgrew their creators' imaginations. As evening fell over Portland, our daily network summary showed connections being made across time zones. A former oil executive in Texas working with a climate activist in Vermont on renewable energy projects. A disgraced politician in Florida collaborating with community organizers in Detroit on grassroots democracy initiatives. The platform David had built was facilitating conversations that would have been impossible in traditional professional settings. People were connecting across ideological, geographic, and industry boundaries because their shared experience of failure created common ground that transcended other differences. "We've accidentally created something unprecedented," Tom observed as he reviewed the day's activity reports. "A professional network based on vulnerability instead of success, where people's worst experiences become their most valuable qualifications." That night, alone in the office after everyone else had gone home, I reflected on the journey from that stormy evening when Victoria had knocked on my door. Sarah's inheritance had been depleted, but her vision had generated resources far beyond money. We'd proven that people who'd lost everything could create value in ways that conventional success never achieved. The Gates Foundation funding would arrive next month, along with the challenges of scaling something built on intimate human connections to a national level. But for the first time since my business had collapsed years earlier, I wasn't worried about the future. We'd learned to build something meaningful from failure itself. the Ripple Network wasn't just helping people recover from setbacks, it was demonstrating that setbacks could become the foundation for unprecedented forms of collaboration and innovation. Sarah had been right about everything except the scope of what was possible. As I turned off the lights and locked up the warehouse, I realized that the scared, broken man Victoria had found 6 months earlier no longer existed. He'd been replaced by someone who understood that his greatest professional failure had been preparation for his most meaningful work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new people ready to transform their setbacks into contributions. The network Sarah had envisioned was becoming something none of us could have imagined, but all of us had been uniquely prepared to build. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday, jolting me awake in the small apartment I'd finally been able to afford near the network headquarters. David's voice through the phone carried a panic I'd never heard from him before. "Marcus, we have a problem. Someone's trying to shut us down." I was dressed and driving through empty Portland streets within minutes, my mind racing through possibilities. Had we violated some regulation? Stepped on the wrong toes? The Ripple Network had been growing so rapidly that we'd probably overlooked something crucial. David met me at the warehouse entrance, laptop in hand and dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd been up all night. It started around midnight. Someone filed complaints with the State Attorney General's office, the IRS, and the Better Business Bureau. All on the same day, all with identical language. He led me to his workstation, where multiple browser windows displayed official-looking documents. The complaints were comprehensive and clearly written by someone with legal expertise. They alleged that the Ripple Network was operating as an unlicensed employment agency, providing financial services without proper certification, and facilitating tax evasion through unreported income arrangements. "This isn't random," I said. Scanning the detailed accusations, someone with resources and legal knowledge orchestrated this. That's what I thought too. So I started digging into our network activity, looking for patterns or connections that might explain who would want to stop us. David pulled up a series of data visualizations showing network member interactions over the past month. Most of the activity looked normal, people making connections, sharing resources, collaborating on projects. But one cluster of activity stood out in stark relief. 3 weeks ago, we connected Dr. Lisa Patterson with Senator James Whitfield, David explained, highlighting specific communications. Patterson is a former pharmaceutical executive who lost her career after blowing the whistle on drug pricing manipulation. Whitfield is a former state legislator who resigned after a corruption scandal. I vaguely remembered the connection. Patterson had reached out through the network looking for someone who understood political processes and could help her navigate congressional testimony about pharmaceutical industry practices. Whitfield had offered to coach her on committee dynamics and media strategy. They've been working together to prepare Patterson's testimony for next week's Senate hearings on drug pricing. But look at this. I pulled up a series of news articles from the past few days. Patterson's upcoming testimony was generating significant attention because she possessed internal documents proving that major pharmaceutical companies had deliberately inflated prices on essential medications while hiding cheaper alternatives. Her testimony could cost these companies billions in lawsuits and regulatory penalties, David said. And our network made it possible by connecting her with someone who understood how to navigate the political system effectively. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We'd created something beautiful, a way for people to support each other through shared understanding and complementary skills. But in doing so, we'd accidentally built a system that could threaten powerful interests. "Who filed the complaints?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be frustratingly vague. "Shell companies registered in Delaware, law firms representing undisclosed clients." Classic corporate warfare tactics designed to create legal chaos while hiding the real opposition. Jennifer arrived just after sunrise, her banker's instincts immediately grasping the severity of our situation. "They're not trying to win these complaints," she said after reviewing the documents. "They're trying to freeze our operations while Patterson's testimony gets derailed." She was right. Each complaint triggered automatic investigation processes. That could take months to resolve. During that time, we'd be operating under legal clouds that would scare away funders, partners, and potentially even network members. But there's something else, Jennifer continued, pulling out her phone to show us a series of text messages. I've been getting calls since 4 a.m. from other network members who are involved in politically sensitive projects. Someone's been contacting them directly, suggesting they distance themselves from the network to avoid legal troubles. The scope of the attack was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Patterson's testimony. It was about dismantling a system that had proven capable of connecting people with dangerous knowledge to people with the skills to amplify that knowledge effectively. Tom arrived with even more disturbing news. His law enforcement contacts had warned him that federal investigators were asking questions about the network, specifically focusing on whether they were facilitating domestic terrorism by connecting former government employees with activists and whistleblowers. They're painting us as a conspiracy platform, Tom explained, suggesting that we're helping people with grudges against their former employers coordinate revenge activities. It was a brilliant attack strategy. Take our greatest strength connecting people based on shared experience with institutional failure and reframe it as a network for coordinating grievances against those same institutions. Maria, who had been monitoring news coverage of the complaints, discovered that the story was already being picked up by conservative media outlets. The narrative being pushed was that the Ripple network was a shadow economy that helped people avoid accountability for their professional failures while plotting against successful businesses and institutions. Returning Sarah's vision. Completely upside down, Maria said, showing us headlines that made us sound like a criminal conspiracy rather than a mutual support network. But as we grappled with the immediate crisis, something unexpected happened. Network members began responding in ways that revealed the true strength of what we'd built. Dr. Patterson called me directly that afternoon. Marcus, I know what's happening. It's scary, but I want you to understand something. 3 weeks ago, I was a broken woman who thought her career destruction had been meaningless. Working with Senator Whitfield through your network didn't just prepare me for testimony. It showed me that my experience with institutional corruption had value beyond my personal suffering. She paused, and I could hear the steel in her voice. That had probably made her a formidable pharmaceutical executive before she chose conscience over career. I'm not backing down from the testimony. I'm not distancing myself from the network. If powerful people are this afraid of what you've built, it means you've built something that actually matters. Similar messages poured in throughout the day. Dr. Chang and Rosa Martinez, the aerospace consultants, announced they were expanding their failure analysis practice specifically to help organizations identify and address corruption vulnerabilities. Michael Torres and Sarah Kim, the crisis communications consultants, offered to help us develop a media strategy that reframed the attacks as validation of our effectiveness. Most remarkably, entirely new people began joining the network specifically because of the negative attention. Dr. Rebecca Foster, a former EPA scientist who'd been fired for refusing to suppress climate research, reached out wanting to connect with others who'd paid professional prices for ethical stands. When I read about the attacks on your network, I realized you'd built something I'd been looking for my entire career, she explained during a video call with our core team. A way for people who've been punished for doing the right thing to support each other and continue their work despite institutional opposition. The attacks had inadvertently revealed the network's true potential. We weren't just helping people recover from random setbacks. We were creating a support system for people whose failures were actually principled stands against institutional corruption, environmental destruction, financial manipulation, and other systemic problems. Jennifer proposed a radical response strategy. Instead of defending ourselves against the specific complaints, we would lean into the larger conversation about why powerful interests feared networks of connected, experienced, uncompromised people. They're attacking us because we're effective, she said during an emergency strategy session. So let's be more effective, working around the clock. David developed new platform features specifically designed to support people in high-stakes situations, secure communication channels for whistleblowers, resource libraries for navigating legal retaliation, connection systems that linked people facing similar institutional pressures. Tom used his law enforcement background to develop security protocols That protected network members from surveillance and intimidation. Maria created rapid response teams that could provide immediate support when members faced professional or legal retaliation, but the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Victoria Whitmore, who had been quietly following the controversy, published an open letter in major newspapers explaining Sarah's original vision and how the current attacks validated everything her daughter had hoped to achieve. Sarah documented people who had been broken by institutional failures, economic systems that prioritized profit over sustainability, professional cultures that punished honesty, political structures that served narrow interests rather than public good, Victoria wrote. She believed that people who had survived these systems' worst impacts could help each other create alternatives. The letter continued, "The current attacks on the Ripple network prove that Sarah was right about something else. Institutions that profit from human suffering will fight viciously against any system that helps. Their victims become empowered and connected." Victoria's letter triggered a media firestorm that completely reversed the narrative. Instead of being portrayed as a shadowy conspiracy, the Ripple network became a symbol of resilience against institutional retaliation. Journalists began investigating the sources of the complaints against us, uncovering connections to the same pharmaceutical companies that Dr. Patterson was set to testify against. 3 days before Patterson's scheduled testimony, the attacks suddenly stopped. The complaints were quietly withdrawn, the negative media coverage ceased, and the federal investigators moved on to other cases. They backed down, Tom explained, because the attacks generated more attention and credibility for the network than years of organic growth could have achieved. He was right. In the week following the controversy, network membership doubled. More importantly, the new members included people with access to information and resources that could challenge powerful interests across multiple industries. Dr. Patterson's testimony went forward as planned, armed with coaching from Senator Whitfield and supported by a network of people who understood the cost of speaking truth to power. Her revelations triggered congressional investigations that would eventually recover billions in overcharges from pharmaceutical companies. But the real victory wasn't stopping the attacks or enabling successful testimony. It was the realization that we'd accidentally created something with transformative potential far beyond what Sarah had originally envisioned. We started out trying to help people recover from individual setbacks. I reflected during our first team meeting after the crisis passed, but we've built something that could fundamentally alter the balance of power between institutions and the people they've harmed. The network was evolving into a platform for institutional accountability, connecting people who possessed dangerous knowledge with people who had the skills and courage to act on that knowledge responsibly. Former employees who'd witnessed environmental crimes were connecting with investigative journalists and regulatory lawyers. Financial industry whistleblowers were working with economists and policy experts to document systemic fraud. Sarah's real genius, Jennifer observed, was recognizing that people who've been chewed up by broken systems develop both the motivation and the expertise to fix those systems. She just didn't anticipate the scale of change that would be possible. A month after the attacks ended, we received an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Williams from the Gates Foundation arrived with news that would reshape everything we thought we understood about our work and its implications. "What you've built here isn't just a mutual support network," she said during a presentation to our expanded team. "It's a prototype for something that could transform how societies handle institutional accountability and systemic change." The Gates Foundation wasn't just offering to fund our expansion. They were proposing to study our model as a potential framework for addressing corruption, environmental destruction, and social injustice on a global scale. The question isn't whether the Ripple network can help people recover from setbacks, Dr. Williams continued. The question is whether networks like yours can help entire societies recover from institutional failures that affect millions of people. As I looked around the room at the team, we'd assembled people who'd lost everything and used that loss as a foundation for building something unprecedented. I realized we were just beginning to understand what Sarah had set in motion that stormy night when her mother knocked on my door. The attacks had been intended to destroy us, but instead they'd revealed our true purpose, creating a world where experience with institutional failure became a qualification for institutional reform. where being broken by corrupt systems became preparation for building better ones. The email arrived on a Sunday morning, buried among dozens of routine network coordination messages. What made it different wasn't the sender, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former CDC epidemiologist I'd never heard of, but the subject line. The pattern you need to see before it's too late. Elena's message was unlike anything we'd received through the network. Instead of seeking connections or offering resources, she was warning us about something she'd discovered while analyzing our own growth data. I've been tracking the Ripple network's expansion patterns using epidemiological models, her email began. What I've found suggests you're not just connecting individuals, you're creating conditions for systemic change that could destabilize existing power structures faster than anyone realizes. She'd included a series of data visualizations that made my stomach drop. Elena had mapped our network connections against corporate board memberships, political donations, and regulatory agency staffing. The patterns revealed something we'd never intended to create: a shadow map of institutional vulnerability. Every major corruption scandal of the past 6 months can be traced to connections made through your platform, Lena's analysis continued. You're not just helping people recover from setbacks. You're weaponizing their institutional knowledge in ways that could trigger cascading failures across multiple sectors. I called an emergency meeting with the core team, sharing Elena's findings on the warehouse's main screen. The visualizations showed network connections spreading like infection vectors through interconnected systems of power and influence. She's right, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the same tone she'd used when analyzing toxic financial instruments during her banking career. We've accidentally created a contagion model for institutional accountability. David pulled up the platform's analytics, adding real-time connection data to Elena's historical analysis. Look at this week's activity alone. We connected a former pharmaceutical researcher with a healthcare journalist, a displaced oil industry engineer with renewable energy activists, fired financial regulator with investigative accountants. Teach. Connection represented knowledge flowing from people who'd been silenced by institutional retaliation to people with the skills and platforms to amplify that knowledge. We'd built something that turned professional destruction into institutional exposure. The corporate attacks last month weren't random, Tom realized. They were an immune response. Powerful interests recognized the threat before we did. Email had included a phone number, and when I called her that afternoon, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much and said too little for too long. I lost my position at CDC for refusing to suppress data about environmental health impacts, she explained. Spent 3 years thinking my career destruction was meaningless, that all my knowledge about disease patterns and public health threats would die with my professional credibility. She paused, and I could hear traffic in the background suggesting she was calling from somewhere she felt safe to speak freely. Then I discovered your network and realized that my experience with institutional suppression of scientific data was exactly what made me qualified to identify similar patterns in other sectors. The pharmaceutical researcher you connected with, the journalist. I helped them understand how regulatory capture works across multiple agencies. Elena had been operating within the network for months, using her epidemiological expertise to help other members understand how institutional corruption spread and where it was most vulnerable to exposure. But her analysis revealed something terrifying. We were approaching a tipping point where the rate of institutional exposure could outpace systems' ability to reform themselves. You've created conditions for what complexity theorists call a cascade failure, Elena warned. When interconnected systems face too many simultaneous challenges, they don't adapt, they collapse. The implications were staggering. The network had grown beyond mutual support into something that could accidentally trigger economic and political chaos by exposing corruption faster than institutions could address it. Jennifer spent the following week developing models that mapped potential cascade scenarios. Her analysis suggested that if network growth continued at current rates, we could reach a point where simultaneous institutional exposures overwhelmed regulatory systems, financial markets, and political structures. We're facing a choice. She reported to the team. We can slow our growth and limit our impact to manageable levels. We can accept that we're potentially triggering systemic change that could destabilize everything. The dilemma was unprecedented. We'd built something with the power to hold institutions accountable on an unprecedented scale. But using that power responsibly required restraint that could limit our effectiveness. Maria proposed a radical solution. Instead of limiting growth, we should accelerate it while simultaneously building systems to manage the chaos we were creating. Elena's epidemiological model assumes that institutional collapse is negative, Maria argued. But what if controlled collapse of corrupt systems is exactly what society needs? What if our role isn't just exposing problems but helping build the replacements? Her proposal was ambitious beyond anything we'd attempted. Instead of just connecting people who'd been harmed by institutional failures, we would create parallel systems designed to function when existing institutions proved inadequate. We're already doing this accidentally, she explained, pulling up examples from the network's recent activity. The community kitchen Elena Rodriguez built isn't just serving meals, it's replacing failed local food security systems. The worker cooperative that former tech executives launched isn't just providing jobs, it's demonstrating alternatives to extractive corporate models. David embraced the concept immediately, recognizing that our platform could facilitate not just connections between people, but connections between alternative systems that could function independently of existing institutions. We're not just building a network, he realized. We're building a backup civilization. The phrase stuck because it captured something profound about what we'd accidentally created. Every successful connection in the network represented not just individual recovery, but proof that people could organize effective solutions outside of traditional institutional frameworks. Elena joined our core team the following month, bringing epidemiological modeling tools that helped us understand and manage the systemic impacts of our work. Her first major project involved mapping what she called institutional resilience zones, areas where existing systems were stable enough to handle gradual reform versus regions where rapid change could trigger beneficial reorganization. The beauty of your model, Elena explained, is that it's organic and responsive. Unlike top-down institutional change, network-driven transformation can adapt to local conditions and scale appropriately. Her analysis revealed that the network was already creating different types of change in different contexts. In stable regions, connections led to gradual reform and increased accountability. In areas where institutions had already failed, network activity was generating rapid alternative system development. We're not imposing uniform change, Elena continued, catalyzing appropriate change based on existing conditions and community needs. 6 months after Elena's initial warning, the Ripple network had evolved into something unprecedented. A decentralized system for institutional accountability that could scale from individual support to societal transformation based on local circumstances and needs. Dr. Patterson's pharmaceutical testimony had triggered investigations that recovered billions in overcharges, but more importantly, it had connected her with researchers developing open source drug development models that could replace the profit-driven pharmaceutical system entirely. The aerospace consultants had moved beyond failure analysis to designing worker-owned manufacturing, cooperatives that produced essential technologies without extractive corporate structures. Most remarkably, network members were beginning to coordinate across sectors, creating integrated alternative systems that addressed multiple institutional failures simultaneously. We've accidentally solved something that philosophers and activists have struggled with for centuries, Tom observed during one of our strategy sessions. How to create systemic change without destroying the communities that depend on existing systems for survival. The answer was elegant in its simplicity. Change institutions by connecting the people they've harmed with the resources and knowledge needed to build better alternatives. Then let those alternatives demonstrate their effectiveness organically, Victoria Whitmore visited on the first anniversary of her midnight appearance at my door, touring network hubs that had sprouted in 17 cities across North America. Her amazement at what had grown from Sarah's original vision was matched only by her daughter's prescient understanding of human potential. Sarah always said that people's worst experiences contained the seeds of their greatest contributions. Victoria reflected as we watched dozens of working groups collaborating on projects that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. But I don't think even she anticipated that individual healing could become collective transformation. As I looked around the warehouse that had become the heart of something unprecedented, I realized that the scared man Victoria had found in a studio apartment had been replaced by someone who understood that personal setbacks could become preparation. For societal solutions, the Ripple Network has proven that when people who've been broken by systems connect with others who've survived similar breakdowns, they don't just recover, they evolve into architects of something better. Sarah's inheritance had been spent, but her vision had generated resources far beyond money, human potential unleashed through authentic connection, institutional knowledge transformed into solutions, and individual resilience scaled into collective power. The network was no longer about helping people recover from failure. It has become a proof of concept for civilization based on wisdom gained through suffering, cooperation born from shared vulnerability, an innovation driven by the understanding that existing systems' greatest victims often become their most effective reformers. 2 years later, I stood in the same spot where Victoria Whitmore had first knocked on my door, but everything else had changed beyond recognition. The building had been converted into affordable housing for network members transitioning between projects. My old studio apartment is now a community space where people gathered to share resources and plan collaborations. The woman standing in the doorway this time wasn't a grieving mother carrying her daughter's unfinished dreams. She was Dr. Amira Hassan, a former Syrian refugee who'd lost her medical practice when her credentials weren't recognized in the United States, then lost her restaurant when the pandemic destroyed small businesses. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice carrying the same mixture of desperation and hope I remembered from that stormy night. "I've been following the Ripple Network for months. I think I understand what you've built, but I need to know, is there room for someone who's failed at rebuilding twice?" Her question took me back to my own moment of complete defeat, when I had thought my business failure defined the limits of my potential. Now I understood that failure wasn't an ending. It was preparation for work that success could never prepare. "You four. Dr. Hassan, there's something you need to understand about this network," I said, inviting her into what had once been my refuge of isolation. "We don't help people recover from failure. We help them discover that their failures were actually preparation for contributions they never would have made otherwise." Over tea in the community kitchen that had replaced my cramped cooking space, Amira shared her story. The medical expertise that the American bureaucracy had deemed worthless had made her uniquely qualified to provide healthcare in refugee communities. The restaurant management skills she'd developed had taught her food distribution logistics that became essential during pandemic relief efforts. "I kept thinking I needed to return to being a doctor in the traditional sense," she explained. "But the work I've been doing, mobile clinics for undocumented immigrants, food security programs for refugee families, that's medicine too. Maybe more important medicine than what I did in my clinic back home." Her realization crystallized, something I'd been struggling to articulate about the network's evolution. We weren't helping people recover their old lives. We were helping them discover that their new lives, shaped by loss and rebuilding, often had more impact than their previous successes ever could. "What would you need to expand that work?" I asked. Amira's eyes lit up with the same intensity I'd seen in every network member who realized their struggles had value beyond survival. Connections with other healthcare providers who understand working outside traditional systems, logistics experts who've dealt with resource scarcity, people who know how to navigate regulatory environments that aren't designed for innovative approaches. Within hours, we'd connected Amira with Dr. Patterson, whose pharmaceutical industry experience had evolved into advocacy for accessible healthcare delivery. Rosa Martinez used her aerospace engineering background to design mobile medical equipment that could function in resource-limited environments. Tom's security expertise helped develop protocols for protecting undocumented patients from immigration enforcement. But the most powerful connection came from Elena's epidemiological modeling, which revealed that Amira's informal healthcare network was preventing disease outbreaks in vulnerable communities more effectively than traditional public health systems. "You're not working outside the healthcare system," Elena explained, during a video conference that included dozens of network members working on health-related projects. you've created a more responsive healthcare system. Question is whether existing institutions can learn from what you've built or whether they'll be replaced by it. That question had become central to the network's identity. We were no longer trying to reform existing institutions from within or tear them down from without. We were simply building better alternatives and letting people choose what worked for their communities. The results were speaking for themselves. Network-incubated worker cooperatives were outperforming traditional corporations in employee satisfaction and community impact. Decentralized education initiatives were achieving better outcomes than many public school systems. Community-managed resource-sharing programs were reducing both poverty and environmental waste. We've stopped asking permission to solve problems. Jennifer observed during our monthly coordination meeting, we're just solving them and dealing with institutional resistance when it emerges. The institutional resistance had evolved too. Instead of attacking the network directly, established systems were beginning to study and incorporate our methods. The Gates Foundation's research had spawned similar initiatives on every continent. Governments were piloting failure-informed policy approaches that prioritized input from people who'd been harmed by previous policies. Even corporations were recognizing the value of hiring people whose setbacks had taught them to think systematically about problem-solving rather than just functionally about task completion. The most successful business leaders of the next decade will be people who've experienced real failure, predicted Dr. Williams during her final research presentation. They've learned resilience, creativity, and collaborative skills that success-focused cultures simply can't develop. Most profound impact wasn't on institutions or economies, it was on how people understood their own stories. Millions of individuals worldwide had stopped seeing their setbacks as interruptions to their real lives and started recognizing them as preparation for their most meaningful work. Maria had documented this transformation through thousands of interviews with network members. People stop asking, "How do I get back to where I was?" and start asking, "What can I build with who I've become?" she explained. That shift in perspective changes everything. The shift was visible everywhere. I looked. David's technology platform had evolved into a comprehensive ecosystem for collaborative problem-solving that was being adopted by organizations worldwide. Tom's security protocols were protecting activists and whistleblowers across multiple continents. Jennifer's financial architecture had spawned alternative economic models that prioritize community resilience over individual accumulation. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was Victoria herself. What had begun as a grieving mother's attempt to honor her daughter's memory had evolved into a global movement that she now coordinated through the Sarah Whitmore Foundation. Sarah would be amazed by what her simple insight unleashed. Victoria told me during our final conversation before she departed for a UN conference on post-conflict reconstruction, she believed that people's worst experiences could become their greatest contributions. She never imagined that insight could reshape how entire societies approach change and resilience. As I watched Victoria's taxi disappear into Portland traffic, I reflected on the journey from that midnight knock to this moment of global recognition. The scared businessman who'd opened that door had been replaced by someone who understood that his greatest professional failure had been preparation for his most important work. The Ripple network had grown beyond anything Sarah had envisioned, but it remained true to her core insight. People who've been broken by systems often develop the exact wisdom and skills needed to build better systems. When those people connect with each other, individual recovery becomes collective transformation. Standing in the community space that had once been my isolation chamber, I realized that Sarah's real gift hadn't been her vision of connecting resilient individuals. Her genius had been recognizing that failure and recovery weren't personal experiences, they were social processes that could be harnessed for unprecedented forms of collaboration and innovation. The network had proven that when people's worst experiences become the foundation for their most meaningful contributions, individual healing scales into societal transformation. Setbacks become setups not just for personal comebacks, but for collective breakthroughs that benefit entire communities. As evening fell over Portland, network coordination messages from 6 continents filled my phone with updates on projects. that were reshaping everything from healthcare delivery to climate adaptation to economic justice. Each message represented someone who transformed their breakdown into a breakthrough that served something larger than their individual recovery. Sarah's inheritance had been spent years ago, but her legacy continued generating resources that money could never provide. Human potential unleashed through authentic connection. Wisdom gained through suffering transformed into solutions for others. And the profound understanding that our greatest setbacks often become preparation for our most essential contributions. The Ripple Network had become proof that when people who've been broken by systems connect with others who've survived similar breakdowns, they don't just recover, they evolve into architects of something unprecedented. A world where failure becomes the foundation for wisdom. Vulnerability becomes the basis for strength. And individual resilience scales into collective power that can transform entire civilizations. The knock on my door that stormy night had been more than a grieving mother seeking closure. It had been the future requesting permission to emerge. From the wreckage of what was, into the possibility of what could be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.